Well, the thorny issue of trade is a key topic that Secretary of State Rex Tillerson is discussing with Chinese leaders when he visits Beijing over the weekend. Given President Donald Trump's blunt criticisms of Beijing's trade practices as well as other policies, bridging the divide may not be easy. VOA's Bill Ide has more from Beijing.
Secretary of State Tillerson's first official visit to Asia, capped off with a stop in Beijing, is seen as an important step in mapping out the road ahead for the world's two biggest economies. He will be talking with Chinese officials about how the two can chart a way forward on trade and other key issues. Acting Assistant Secretary of State Susan Thornton.
We want to be able to pursue a constructive discussion with China that enables us to get at sort of problem areas and make progress on issues.
Trump complained frequently about China's trade practices on the campaign trail, threatening to impose tough import tariffs on Chinese goods and promising to label the country a currency manipulator. None of that has happened yet, and since Trump and China's Xi Jinping spoke last month on the phone, relations appear to be moving in a positive direction.
And to get a sense of the evolving relationship between the U.S. and China and the State Secretary's visit to Asia, we are joined in Washington by former senior diplomatic correspondent and now VOA White House Bureau Chief Steve Herman, along with the host of VOA's Asia in a Minute, international broadcaster Steve Miller. Thank you both, gentlemen, for being with us. Steve Miller, let me talk to you about this first because you lived in Asia for many years. What is it that these countries in Asia want or need from the United States?
Well, they're really kind of looking for what the United States wants to do in Asia. During the campaign, candidate Trump made some very disparaging comments about Chinese trade and troops in the region. So as Secretary Tillerson said, he is there to listen and to speak with the various heads of states and government officials to kind of relay the administration's approach.
And Steve Herman, how much of a divide or how much of a gap is that going to be in trying to get relationships moving forward, given candidate Trump's very antagonistic comments on the campaign trail?
Well, I think what the Chinese are going to look at, they're very pragmatic. They're going to look at actions rather than just words. Words, obviously, they're very sensitive when it wounds matter, Chinese pride. But the bottom line is action and what the Americans actually put on the table.
But Steve Herman, as you mentioned to me earlier, really the key issue is going to be security when Tillerson meets with his counterparts in Asia, North Korea being number one.
Sure, let's face it, for the Chinese, for the South Koreans, for the Japanese and others, if there's war with North Korea or there's some total chaos that happens there, it's not going to help the economy. So that is one aspect of what we're dealing with here. But there is a very strong security concern in Beijing as well. And from the United States point of view and from the Japanese as well, for many years, they've been saying, look, the Chinese are the only ones that can possibly restrain North Korea. But what the Chinese do want to squeeze Pyongyang, but they don't want to suffocate the North Koreans because it then becomes China's problem.
What's clear, Steve Miller, according to State Secretary, is that the United States policy regarding North Korea has not been working, has not worked, and perhaps a more muscular approach is needed. What is the view in Asia regarding a stronger U.S. military response, perhaps? That's
one of the big questions that many people have is what kind of response will come forward. I mean, Secretary Tillerson said that the past 20 years have amounted to a failed policy, that strategic patience is over, and something new needs to be done to address the threats in North Korea. And that's one of the conversations he's having in Japan, in South Korea, and plans to have in China when he goes there over the weekend to see what options are available.
I think there's others who would argue with that position that the policy has failed. In a sense, yes, it hasn't stopped North Korea from developing nuclear weapons. It hasn't stopped advance of their ballistic missile programs. There is a growing threat. But we have not had active war with North Korea. There is still technically a state of war. There was an armistice, never a treaty. We keep saying that on this program. Sure. Things are always on a hair trigger on the Korean peninsula at the demilitarized zone, as we just saw. The South Koreans and the North Korean soldiers, along with the U.S. army are face to face, literally there. And this cannot go on forever. But I think what is significant from what he's saying today, number one, we haven't heard these comments as overtly expressed by previous administration because military options have always been on the table. But what is different now, I think, instead of saying, as every administration has done, let's just wait for North Korea to collapse. It's going to collapse eventually. I think there's a realization now that, this isn't going to happen 6 months from now. The North Koreans have outlived all expectations, and so we have to deal with this rising threat. And one thing to do is just to push back on the rhetoric. The North Koreans are always talking about war being imminent. So for the United States to up the rhetoric to another level, that's getting on, I think, a level playing field as far as the rhetoric with the North Koreans.
So this
may be
is,
helpful.
Steve Miller, this is the United States playing the same game that Pyongyang is playing. I wonder how this is playing out in South Korea.
Well, South Koreans are always, I would say, a little bit detached from the Western media because living in Seoul, as we both have, when rhetoric increases, life in Seoul remains the same, 60 or so miles south of the DMZ. You don't feel that tension. It's often looked at as overcharacterization of the threat. Even when North Korea says they're going to illuminate Seoul in a sea of fire, people in South Korea really don't take that seriously because they view that as if North Korea carried out some kind of action like that, the response from South Korea, from Japan, from the United States, from allies would be so overwhelming toward North Korea that it would end the regime.
I think there's also been a bit of a sense of denial. I lived in Seoul for a few years, and as Steve said, it's just going on every day. That baseline is pretty high. But I think that a lot of South Koreans don't want to really confront this awful situation that they've been facing since the 1950s.
What South Korea needs from the United States is some kind of defense support. Right now, what we know is the THAAD missile system is being deployed in South Korea. How badly is that going to hurt relations between South Korea and China?
We've already seen some of the indications with the closure of a number of Lotte department stores in China, the cancellations of K-pop and opera performances, cancellation of flights. I think we mentioned last time that several politicians in South Korea were looking at possibly filing a WTO complaint against China for these alleged activities. And that's one of the conversations that in some op-eds in Korean newspapers have said that perhaps since we're deploying a U.S. missile system, the United States should bear some of the consequences with that. And that was a statement also echoed by China that if that is deployed on the Korean Peninsula, both Seoul and Washington would bear the consequences of that.
But I think South Korean foreign policy towards China, the United States, how to deal with North Korea, is all on hold right now until the May 9th presidential election. Unless there's an actual war, we're not going to see anything happening in South Korea.
Right, and to piggyback on that, a lot of the opposition candidates that are the front runners in this May 9th election are either opposed to deploying THAAD or want to scale it back or have some serious conversations as what's to do next because of the interactions with China.
And the U.S. has to figure out a way to sort of play a supporting role amidst all of those complicated demands. But Steve Herman, before we actually go, you've covered a number of state secretaries before, Kerry in particular. How does Tillerson's approach vary in terms of style versus, say, Hillary Clinton or even John Kerry?
Well, I think we are seeing much more blunt comments when he actually chooses to speak in public, which is very rare.
Very rare.
He has
right?
a very different attitude towards the press. He has upset the traditional core of correspondents who cover the State Department by not taking them on his plane, giving unilateral access to favored conservative outlets. There is definitely a much more hostile relationship with the U.S. media, but we don't know what's exactly going on behind closed doors. And until we see firm establishment of policy, I think it's too early to make any verdict about Rex Tillerson.
But what we know for sure is for reporters right now, it's a lot harder to get answers.
Absolutely.
Right? Okay, well, thank you very much to Steve Herman and Steve Miller. We're going to take a short break right now, but when we come back, a big election in a small country.